more on President Bush's whitewash of the White House history during the buildup to the Iraq War, let's turn now to Chris Hayes, the Washington editor of The Nation magazine. Chris, good evening.
Hey, Keith.
That term, cherry picking, implying that a lot of other fruit that was left behind on the scene. What about the good intelligence on the absence of WMD in Iraq that was ignored during that time? I didn't hear in the full interview with Charlie Gibson, I didn't hear President Bush mention any of that.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's so galling about the whole sort of alternative history that the Republican Party and large parts of the right has constructed around the Iraq War is to pinpoint bad intelligence as this kind of thing that they on the right were sadly a victim of, as opposed to the perpetrators of. I mean, we know for a fact that Dick Cheney was driving over to the CIA and standing over the desks of analysts, browbeating them essentially into towing his line on the weapons of mass destruction, and then recycling it through and leaking it to the New York Times, etc. So the story they've constructed for themselves gets the causality of exactly what happened with the intelligence in Iraq exactly backwards.
Having a discussion about the false intelligence and how it was Bush's biggest regret of his presidency, it would be predicated both on the idea that he didn't know there was alternate information, as well as complicity from and in the media mainstream here in allowing that premise. There's a really huge assumption in there, is there not?
Yeah, one of the things I think that's most interesting, I mean, in an academic sense, I suppose, is just how much he, even at this late point, when all of us in the world know more or less what happened in terms of the manipulation of intelligence in the lead up to Iraq, how much he actually knows. I mean, I wonder if he's written some of the, he's read some of the books that have been written about exactly that process, or I wonder if he still remains kind of in the dark. I mean, one of the images that we take away from a lot of the histories that have already been written on this period is the fact that Cheney sort of acted as this kind of gatekeeper. And you kind of wonder if, even to this day, he doesn't actually understand what really did happen in the run-up to the war that went so terribly wrong.
Well, perhaps exactly to your point, in the interview, the president also claimed that other governments had been relying on the same intelligence. And I seem to recall that anybody who was relying on the same intelligence was getting it from us with our spin on it, with that Cheney stamp on it. And people who were not like the French were rather public about the fact that they didn't buy any of it.
That's exactly right. I mean, the other crucial point to make about that, in response to that argument, which also gets brought up by some of the dead-enders, is the fact that there's a reason that you don't launch preemptive wars. And it has to do with the fact that intelligence is always a very difficult enterprise. It's incredibly difficult to attain certainty, even under good conditions, when you don't have this heavy political pressure being brought to bear on the intelligence agencies. There's an inherent connection between the doctrine of not launching preemptive wars and the fact that intelligence is, of its nature, not a sure science. And that connection is something that I think the Bush administration and the people who continue to this day to say the war was the right thing to do, they want to get rid of that and say, well, the problem was just the intelligence was wrong. The problem was actually the entire notion that you could launch preemptive war in the way they did.
So I'm thinking, having heard this interview and a second reference to his regrets about WMD, I'm wondering if we're not missing the point here ultimately. Is it really possible that he doesn't regret that it was wrong, he doesn't regret being in charge of the least justified war probably in American history, but that he is actually saying, I regret there were not WMD in Iraq?
That's exactly right, and it was so revealing when Gibson asks him the hypothetical, which everyone immediately understands as a hypothetical about what would have, if the intelligence were right, was the question, I think, meaning if you knew there were no weapons. And he said, you mean if they had weapons? Because that to him was, and that shows exactly how much the intelligence was retrofitted to kind of fit this preconceived notion. Even when at this late date asked that hypothetical question, that's the first scenario that jumps to his mind.
Yeah, exactly. The intel was wrong because we didn't find the WMD. Therefore, since we knew they were there, then it was the intel that was wrong. It was the, you know, we know the sun comes up in the west and here it is in the east. Somebody's intel about the sun's wrong. Chris Hayes, the Washington editor of The Nation, as always, great thanks, Chris.
Thank you, Keith.